Okay, this is Debra Richardson, and we are right at the top of the hour. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to the live webinar, Best Practices for Collecting and Validating Vendor Banking Details that you receive via email. Now, before we begin, some housekeeping items. This session is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording within 3 days. Actually, unless something goes wrong, you'll get it tomorrow about this same time. Feel free to submit your questions anytime. We will save for the Q&A session during the last 15 minutes. And if I don't, or we don't get to all of your call or questions during the Q&A session, additional questions can be asked via email. And then lastly, don't forget to download the handouts, a PDF of the presentation, along with a PDF brochure. And if at any time you do not or cannot see the screen, go ahead and throw that in the questions and let me know. One other option, if you cannot see the screen, is you can always download the PDF presentation and follow along, but I don't think there's going to be any issues. So we'll just keep going. All right, so for those of you who are new here, I want to first introduce myself. I am Debra R. Richardson, and you may have heard of me by my saying, putting the AP in happy. And as a previous AP senior manager, managing a team of 17, processing over 2,000 vendor requests per month. And as you can imagine, many vendor bank adds and changes. I now work with AP vendor teams that are still fully or partially manual to add authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices. And don't feel bad if you still, you think you're behind in having manual processes. There are lots of manual processes out there, even from some of the Fortune 500 and Fortune 200 and Fortune 15 companies out there. So you are in good company, but we do have some processes or best practices today to help you with that. In addition to this webinar, I do have a site dedicated to the vendor setup and maintenance process, where I have some free resources and tools, including a blog, a podcast, on-demand webinars, all known for providing actionable steps, just like you're going to see in today's webinar. And that's to help you with your vendor maintenance issues, including the collection and update of vendor banking details. So looking at the agenda, we're first going to look at fraud in vendor banking. And then we'll talk about my authentication validation management proprietary process to avoid fraudulent payments in the vendor setup and maintenance process. And then we'll take a look at each separately and how those separate sections, how you can use them to help in the collection of vendor banking so that you can avoid fraudulent payments. And then we'll end up with a Q&A session. So let's talk about fraud in accounts payable and the collection and update of vendor banking. So looking at the US first, this is the US maps, and the stats are taken from the FBI 2019 report of IC3 complaints. You can check your state to see where you fall. Total complaints for the year averages to about 1,300 per day. And of course, business email compromise scams, where a fraudster attempts to trick AP team members into believing they are a CEO or the vendor to add or change vendor bank details, diverting payments. That resulted in more than $1.7 billion in losses. And it's going to be interesting to see this report for 2020 because, as you can imagine, BEC started to rise in Q2 2020, and in Q3 Q3, it rose 15% higher than Q2 2020. Not surprising due to COVID-19. Also, the average BEC scam rose from 53,000 to 80,000 per incident in 2020. Now, if you need to file a complaint, I've added a link here. And please do file. This, of course, is based on what has been reported, and not all companies will report their business email compromise or that they were a victim of business email compromise. And this is a global issue. The International Criminal Police Organization, or Interpol, is an intergovernmental organization with 194 member countries. And in October 2019, they launched a public awareness campaign for business email compromise with the hashtag #BECCareful. Now, unlike the FBI, Interpol directs you to report criminal activity to the local or national police. But the key here for global fraud is really to be proactive in implementing authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices, because no APT member can be 100% all day, every day to spot these fraudulent emails, especially as many APT members are still working from home, working remotely, still affected by the pandemic. Also, if you've been to any of my other webinars, I keep showing these same fraud slides with trending updates because I just want to make sure that vendor teams are not getting comfortable. I talk to clients and potential clients all the time, and it seems like they're getting used to fraud attempts, noting that, oh, they're only about 20,000 each and we seem to catch them. And I always want to ask, well, what about the ones you didn't catch? But my advice here is just not to get comfortable. And one of the main reasons is, what you may not have thought about, and maybe you have, is the effect on you or your team. So while we know fraud is evolving, what you may not be aware of is so are the actions that companies are taking against employees. Now, in the US, I have only heard of employees being let go. If that, not that that's not a bad thing, it is, but in the UK, there are at least 2 incidents where they are taking stronger actions. The first one, a worker was fined $7,500 because he wired 3 payments, totaling almost $512,000 without first confirming with the client, because that was a part of their process. In the second one, an employee was actually sued because she paid a cyber criminal a net of $138,000. I think it was 200 and some, and they got some of that back. But the judge did rule in her favor, but in a subsequent article, she stated she considers herself unemployable due to that lawsuit. And if you're having trouble convincing your CEO or your CFO, they're not immune either. An Australia company fired both their CEO and CFO after a $61 million fraud occurred. Now, they were both sued, and while the judge dismissed their cases, this is still more evidence that adding to the trend of employers taking action against their employees, all the way to the top. So whether you're collecting vendor bank details to set up a new vendor record, a new payment method, or are changing existing vendor bank details, let's start looking at best practices you can implement today to add some security to your process of accepting bank details by email. But before we do that, we're going to get started with our first poll question, and I'm going to go ahead and launch that. And that question is, what do you currently require before adding or updating existing vendor bank details? A, bank details on bank or vendor letterhead. B, a voided check. C, phone call to the vendor. 2 or more of the above. or none of the above. So I'll give you about 30 seconds to go ahead and vote on that, and then we will go from there. So it looks like we've got some coming in. Most are 2 or more of the above, which means you may be doing all 3, which is great. Okay. We've got a couple coming in on, or some coming in on bank details. Okay. About 10 more seconds. So go ahead and vote if you already haven't. All right, so it looks like 89% require 2 or more of the above, and then 11% require the bank details on bank or vendor letterhead. All right, so thanks for the responses. I'm going to go ahead and close that. Okay. All right, so I will go ahead and go to the next screen, and we will talk about, start with my proprietary authentication validation management process that I use for my clients that still have manual or fully manual vendor processes to make sure that they have real vendors, avoid fraud and regulatory fines. And then again, we're going to apply that to collecting and validating vendor bank details. But first, this summary. So the first step is authentication, and we're going to talk a lot about that today, which is the confirmation of the vendor data source or delivery method of the vendor documentation. And the data source can be who is sending. The delivery method can be email or vendor portal or fax or even hard copy. And for this section of the webinar, we are focusing on a manual process with the email delivery because it's vendor bank details you receive via email. So we're going to be using authentication using the data source or who is sending the email. Now, we're also going to talk about authentication of the data, so we'll get to that as well. But if you want to design an authentication template, which we will see in the next slide for your team, I do have an authentication fully interactive workshop. I have those every Thursday. They are at a cost at $79, but if you compare that to the average 80 grand of an average BEC scam, it's really not a lot when you look at it that way. So make sure if you're requesting approval, you include that comparison. Now, step 2 is validation, where you validate vendor data before it is entered into your ERP. And to help with this, I do have a free download, which I have a link here. You can go right over to my site and download it. But it is a vendor validation reference list with resource links, which identifies not only resources to verify a vendor is real and not on any watch list, but it's also divided based on the type of information being validated and on which document you'll find it, such as the invoice or a contract. And it also includes the banking validation sources that we're going to talk about in this webinar today. Now, the third step is management, where you revalidate or inactivate existing vendors in your vendor master file on a consistent basis. And I do want to stress consistent basis. So inactivating those vendors you haven't done business with in 15, 18, or 24 months, and then checking for duplicate vendors, which can be, an issue or which can be an indication of fraud and also duplicate payments. But checking for those duplicate vendors and then revalidating active vendor data to make sure there are no changes and making sure they have not been added to a watch list since you originally set them up or modified them last. It also includes internal controls and best practices for managing your vendor master file. And I do have a free on-demand webinar called 8 Steps to Clean Your Vendor Master File when you're doing it manually, if you want some steps on that. And you may also see on my site there, I do have another webinar, on-demand webinar. I didn't link it here, but if you go to my site and go to webinars, you'll see it. I also have a separate one talking about the tools that I use when I clean my vendor master file. So you can watch both of those and get some information. And I also have them on YouTube on my channel, and I do have timestamps for the on-demand webinars where you can just kind of jump around to what you need. Okay. I also have an e-guide that includes 5 authentication techniques, 12 internal controls, and 13 plus best practices. And it is this whole process. It's about 66 pages. And I have a special offer at the end of this webinar if you would like to purchase. So now let's look at authentication in vendor bank details. And really, we're going to be looking at 2 different places. I know I talked about the validating or authenticating the person that's sending the information, but we're also going to talk about something authenticating the data as well. So getting started with, receiving the request to add or update banking details. You need to authenticate the requester, whether they are a vendor or an employee submitting documents on behalf of the vendor. And you can do that by asking 2 or 3 identifying questions. And this process should sound familiar to you, as this is what your banks do, for example. This is what they put you through when you call in to make changes or get information on your account. Same thing. For vendors, you can confirm 2 or 3 validations that only the vendor or employees of the vendor would know. You want to make sure you have 5 or more to choose from so that you're not asking the same questions each time. Another critical key is to make sure you're not asking for elements on the same document. And this is the reason for the different columns here. For example, you don't want to ask for an invoice number and an invoice date, since that information is on the same document. Better to ask for an invoice number and the last 4 digits of the tax ID, or for a valid purchase order number and the last 4 digits of the existing bank account. For new vendors, you can ask for the buyer name or the name of the employee that requested their service, plus a contract or invoice number if it's not a PO vendor. So these types of things can be, I've just put some examples here, but they should really be customized for your company. I've even had one client that did have a vendor self-registration portal, but still used it because they had quite a few vendors that were still calling in, and they had to handle those vendors that could not or was having problems with the registration process. So I just added a column here, or we added a column for the portal, and we put things in it like the registration invitation email, or maybe the ID that's generated when they start the registration. So this can really be customized, which is another reason why I have those workshops on Thursdays. For internal employees, yes, you may need to authenticate internal employees if your email system does not flag emails as external, or if employees emails, or if an employee will email you outside of the work email system. I mean, I'm sure we have, or you probably have all your issues with remote work resolved, but there still may be those folks that can't get access to their work email from home, or they may even, call you outside of the company phone system. And so this is a good template to have for that as well. You want to, again, confirm 2 or 3 validations that only the employee would know, and make sure that the team, you or your team, has access to that information so you can verify it. For example, you can use their next level up and their cubicle number. Now, this reference template can be a critical step in preventing fraud as we move into the second wave of the pandemic, and again, this increased remote working. And by the way, this authentication reference template works well when taking live phone calls, especially if you create a script. And it is included with the e-guide and the toolkit. And again, I'll have some special offers at the end of this webinar. Okay. Now, once they successfully authenticate, instead of accepting their banking details on a company or bank letterhead, which can be forged, or you can have this in addition to what you're currently collecting, make sure you send them a company branded ACH form and require authentication on that form. Only send the form to those that authenticate, because you don't want a cyber criminal trying to gather information for this form. So I do require or recommend that you require authentication on the banking form. And for a new vendor setup, you can require the internal employee contact name and email address. For changes, you can require the existing bank details. And by the way, if you get pushback that they don't have the existing bank details, it just means you're talking to the wrong person. You need to make sure that you either work with their AR team, or you make sure that they know that they need to go back and work with whomever they need to get that information, because they have to keep that information, retain it on payments that they receive for a number of years. So that information is there. You just need to push back and get it. But you can also ask for the last 3 payments with deposit dates and amounts. I also recommend that you require the full tax ID. This also helps you to make sure you're dealing with the right vendor record, especially if you have a system like SAP and you've got the parent-child relationship going. You want to make sure that you have the right remit vendor. You can add any company unique element that you and the vendor would know. You can add that on there as well. Now, optional, but I do recommend it, is you require the remit address. This again helps you, since some accounting systems like PeopleSoft have multiple payment locations tied to separate remit addresses, and having it on the form ensures you're updating the right location. The vendor ID can be a help to know the right vendor ID, again, in those systems like SAP, where you can have more than one vendor ID for the same tax ID. And again here, any company unique element. Now, best practices for the branded ACH form is to change it every year. Do not post it on any company website. Again, because you only wanted to send it to those that have authenticated it. And by the way, if you change that every year, you avoid the process if you have internal employees that are gathering the information from the vendors. You avoid that whole, where they're saving the form on their desktop or somewhere for years and years and just keep using that same form. Because again, you don't know who they're sending it to. They may not have had training. So you want to make sure that you refresh that form every year, because if you get an old form, it could be an indication of fraud. Also, it may not include any information that you've determined needed to be added. Okay, so again, I do have a toolkit that contains templates for vendor setup forms, desktop procedures, vendor communications, and it does include a template branded ACH forms with fillable fields for your vendor to populate, including the existing bank details, internal employee contact, and the full tax ID. And again, I'll have a special offer, but let's take a look at that. I'll give you an example, and here is an example of the form. I'm sorry it's not very big, but you will have it in the PDF. And this form includes, again, the remit address, the tax ID, if they have if they are changing banking, it requires them to include the previous banking information. And again, that's authenticating that data. If they are a new vendor, it requires them to provide the department name, just their contact employee that they're talking to. And so this is an example. So if you have one already, or if you want to create one, you can use this as a guide to create one or update the one that you currently have, or you can purchase this and customize it, saving you about 5 to 7 hours from having to create this form. So this will be a great savings for you, but feel free to use it as a guide to create your own or to update an existing form that you have. Now, next is the validation and vendor banking. And so let's take a look at, now once you've received the company branded ACH form, you want to validate the bank branch data first. So that's the routing ABA number, the SWIFT code, or the IBAN. And the reason you want to do that is just to make sure that the payments are processed successfully. And this is a good one for cleanup too, when you're doing your vendor master file cleanup, because when banks are acquired or merged, their routing numbers will change, and vendors won't tell you that. I mean, they'll still send you that voided check with the old routing number on it because they've had that pack of checks for I don't know how long. So you want to make sure that it's part of your cleanup too. But when you receive banking details, make sure you verify it. And again, you want to make sure that you're processing like notice of changes that you get if you do process a transaction that has an old routing number on it. But how to validate that? It's free. There's the FBR Services has an ACH wire routing or ABA lookup tool, and we know it's important for successful payments, but it can also be great to verify that the routing number you're using is good for ACHs versus wires, because some banks have different routing numbers depending on the payment method. And then if you have a non-US bank that does not require an IBAN, you'll have a SWIFT or BIC, and that is a free lookup as well. Right. Now, there is a paid service out there, TGBR, and I don't know what that stands for, but it's on Acuity.com, and it's a subscription plan, and I think they may have even changed the name. But the benefit to this paid service, or the advantage, is they have the history of bank numbers, which can help with banks that have been merged or acquired, like we talked about earlier. Also, they have a product called IBAN Complete, which can assist with the correct IBAN format by country. All right, so before we get to the next one, I'm going to launch the second poll question, because the next one we're going to be talking about bank account ownership. And I just want to see what you guys are currently doing. So I'll go ahead and launch it. Do you validate bank account ownership? And if you do, how do you currently do it? So if you validate bank account ownership, are you using early warning or their reseller GIAC? Are you using NSNOX? Are you using the bank because they've got know your customer requirements to verify the beneficial owner? Or are you using something else, a pre-note process, a third-party provider? Because we know a lot of those with payment solutions will handle the validations themselves. And then or we do not verify bank account ownership. So about 10 more seconds for that. So go ahead and vote if you haven't already voted. All right, so it looks like we have 83% do not verify bank account ownership, while 17% do. Well, for those 83%, don't feel bad. Not a lot. It's not a lot of usage out there yet. It's growing, and so let's talk about what that really means. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. Okay. All right, so moving on to validation. So now that you have validated the bank's data, you want to validate bank account ownership, or it's definitely an option. So let's talk about the reason to validate, of course, is to ensure payments are paid to the correct vendor and not a fraudulent bank account controlled by a cyber criminal. And how you validate that, so I'm not really sure if there are any free options. I originally put here it's available, only available via paid subscription, but I'm not sure if there is a charge for the bank when they do like the beneficial owner pre-note micro deposits, and that may depend on the relationship or the account that you have with your bank. And one of the things, why I have never done this, I have heard other companies say that they work with their bank and send a file of vendor data to verify their vendor bank accounts. After all, as part of the Know Your Customer requirements and other regulations, banks do their own due diligence, and they even collect the tax ID when opening up a business bank account. So this may be an option for you. You may also have the option of a pre-note, although there's really no guarantee that the vendor name will be returned, so that may not be 100% effective. And both pre-notes and micro deposits take time. I know that there are some efforts underway with NACHA for real-time pre-notes, so more to come on that in 2021. But this is definitely an option for you, and you may want to just contact your bank to see what they have available. The next one is, and we did have 10% respond back. We had some late votes coming in, respond back saying that they use early warning or GIAC. And paid subscription, early warning, or their reseller GIAC. And the difference between those is you would use early warning if you bank with one of the 6 or 7 banks that are part of that consortium. So I know it's Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, what else is it? BB&T, and what's some other ones? Wells Fargo. So if you bank with one of those 6 banks, and you can check it on their site, I have a link here, then you can get early warning. Otherwise, you would need to get GIAC systems, and they both use the same database, which banks around the US will contribute their depositor information to this database. And with that, they will confirm bank account ownership, and you can compare the bank account holder name with your vendor's legal name. The downside is that it is the US only, because international or non-US banks do not contribute to this database. And with that, there is another option out there called NSNOX. And NSNOX uses a pre-note process, and so it can take some time as well. But what they have is a database, and that database is made up of suppliers or vendors that have triggered pre-notes to validate their bank account ownership. And so you would get a subscription to that. You would be able to look them up in the database. if they are not already in the database, then you can send them a link to register and then trigger that pre-note transaction, so that once it's validated, you can be sure that they own the bank account that you're setting up. Now, again, this is a pre-note process, so it can take up to 48 hours. I actually do, and I meant to link it here, but I do have I did a webinar with them back in July, and I do have it on my website under webinars if you want to take a look. It does include a demo from them on their product, and they do integrate with accounting or ERP systems, and they even in the demo demoed how that integrates with SAP, which is really good, because if you guys have SAP, you know how bad your bank table can be. So it also helps with that as well. All right, so that's it with bank account ownership, validating that. Now, let's move on to management and vendor banking. So now that you have authenticated by requiring authentication of the sender and of the data received, and now have validated the bank account information, here are 3 additional steps that you can take to add more security. So the first one is to confirm with the vendor the bank change by phone. So we all know this. The best practice is to confirm using contact information on the vendor record, not in the email. Also, not confirming with someone different that requested the change. That's another best practice. Another best practice here is to make sure that you track or document the attempts. I call it a confirmation log, where you log the day, the date, the time, the phone number called, where you got the phone number from, the team member that called, and what happened or what the status is. And this comes in handy to track pending confirmations. This way, if something happens to the original employee that called, someone can know where to jump in and start to continue the process. Also, management can then monitor to make sure pending confirmations are being followed up on, so the requests are not aging, increasing turnaround time. Because as most of you are probably doing this, you know that the vendor may not be available the first or second time that you call. So you need to document those. And now, I don't know if any of you are familiar with my blogs, but this was actually the first blog that I wrote back in October of 2018, and it is still good today. And that is to send a notification to the vendor. Now, a best practice, it is a best practice the same way that your bank or PayPal or Amazon or Netflix or now Disney Plus will send you a notification email that information on your account has been changed. And if you did not initiate the change to take action, like contact them or change your passwords, you can do the same thing with your vendors. Okay? And then the last one is review a report of added or changed vendor banking details. And this really is an internal control, compensating control that can be used when there is a segregation of duties in AP. However, you can use it to verify or catch fraud before vendors are paid. And you want to verify the adds and changes against the supporting documentation. So make sure whoever has to review those reports has access to the supporting documents that the vendor submitted. Okay. And I think that's all I have here. All right, so just to recap, these were my immediate takeaways. And if you do not have them as part of your manual process to collect and or update vendor banking, please consider adding them to prevent fraudulent payments. And yes, they do add extra steps and they do take more time. And not only that, they are still, there is still the risk that your employees will not follow the process, or that they will be human error, but you need to implement this and include it in your processes. And also make sure that, I didn't list it here, but if you're not doing a vendor process audit, most of us are used to higher level audits, either internally or externally, but we really need to get down to the vendor process level, so that auditors are auditing how vendors are being set up, what's being required, making sure that authentication is done. And the only way to do that is to put that vendor process audit into place. So make sure that you're doing that. And I do have some more information on that on my website, including I do have a template for desktop procedures, so that you can document your product process, and so that it can audit against that documented process. All right, so lastly, third poll question. Let me go ahead and launch that. So I actually do come up with some products where I think it would help. The last thing that I came up with was global vendor registration numbers, because you know not everyone uses a tax ID, and so I have a digital product that will show global registration numbers for 100+ countries. The next thing I'm thinking about doing is a document that breaks down bank branch and bank account details by country. Not sure if I'm going to do that, but I want to just get some, see if there's any interest here. So if you can answer yes, no, not sure. I'll give you about 10 more seconds, and then if that's a yes, I'll probably work on that to make that available in 2020, early 2021. All right, so it looks like 71% says not sure. We've got 14% saying yes, 14% saying no. So hopefully those that are saying no, you already have a document that you can use. And those that are not sure, maybe if I do create it, depending on what countries I include, because it's kind of difficult to research and get all that information by country, but not necessarily difficult, it's just a little complex. So in trying to get all that information. So more to come on that. Now we've got 20% saying yes, so I'm going to go ahead and close that. Look for that. If I do launch it, I will definitely let you know, have it on my website. If you're a subscriber, you'll see it in email, so keep a watch out for that. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. All right, so we've got about 2 minutes before the question and answer, so I do want to tell you about the discount that I have, and it's 25% using webinar 25. That discount will be effective through Monday, November 16th, and you can use that to get the vendor banking form template. You can use that to get the 3-step vendor setup and maintenance process e-guide I talked about. And then if you want the banking ACH form or the vendor banking form template, along with desktop procedure templates, email, vendor communications, it includes the e-guide, it includes the global vendor registration numbers. You can also get the toolkit. But I do recommend you go to my site no matter what you do. I have lots of free resources. So we talked about the free validation reference list. I talked about the free desktop procedure template. I also have a free W-8 expiration date tracking form, because you know December 31st after the third year, December 31st of the third year, your W-8s need to be collected again, and so I do have a tracking form that you can download to use for that. And many of you are probably in that process right now. So if you don't have a tracking form, make sure you go to my site and download it. Okay. So plenty of free resources, all are immediate downloads. Okay. And then lastly, I want to invite you to connect with me. I've got my contact information here, as well as all of the links on social media platforms, link to my podcast, and make sure you go to my YouTube channel. It's fairly new, but I am building a lot of content. Again, it does include all of the on-demand webinars. This will be on there as well, and they do have timestamps, so you can jump around to whatever part you need to if you only want a certain section. I also have a vendor master file tip of the week, and that's usually less than 5 minutes. So I've got a few of those up if you want to check them out. So make sure you subscribe, and also you hit the notification button. I do publish the vendor master file tip of the week every Tuesday. All right, so now it is your turn, and I do have some questions here, so we'll get started with those. So the first one, will we be receiving a copy of the slide deck? So yes, you will. Unless there are any issues, tomorrow you will receive a copy of the slide deck along with a link to the recording. And if you didn't download the documents or the handouts here, the link to the recording will include a copy of the handout, so you can download them there. The next question is, with many people working from home due to the pandemic and not having access to a work phone number, is an intercompany communication system like Teams or Skype sufficient for authenticating an employee? So I would say yes, that is. But what I would also say is and you may need to check with your IT team to make sure this is okay, but you want to make sure you document that authentication. So when you're authenticating by email, you want to make sure that you save a copy of that, print a copy of that to like a PDF or some electronic document, and attach that to the vendor record. The same thing with the phone. If you authenticate by phone, you're really only, by phone authenticating them so you can send them some information. They can send that back to you, so you're still authenticating via email. But since your messaging software will be like the communication, I would also say you want to make sure that you have some documentation of that as well. So print it to PDF and attach it to the vendor record or wherever you save your supporting documentation, because you want to have proof of that. And so just make sure you check with your IT team or whatever applicable team to make sure there are no privacy issues with saving that. Okay. The next question is that internal control of reviewing a report of vendor record changes something you would spot check? How would you make that report review efficient? So I don't know that a spot check is really something that would help a lot, because that spot check can mean that you miss fraud. If you are doing that report, that typically means that you have some type of segregation of duties issue, where you don't have the collection, the posting of the invoice, the creation or update of the vendor record, and the generation of the payment. You don't have those duties split. So that's not something that I would spot check. And again, you know, making that report review efficient, you may be able to utilize AI or RPA, especially RPA, because RPA is something that if you have that software available, you can program that to generate that report, and that way you don't have to go in and generate it. It can just be in your email, and there may be other ways to automate that process, but it still needs to have that review. And I do recommend that you, in addition to reviewing the report, that you actually go to that vendor record, you verify the supporting documentation that was submitted. Now, one thing you can do that I recommend you do no matter what is, if you are running that report, you make sure that you include like the timestamps of changes, because that will let you hone in on those instances where you had a bank account that was changed and then changed back quickly. That can be a red flag indication of fraud. But if you are running that report, someone needs to review it. And again, you know, we like to be efficient because AP is, you know, we've got a lot of transactions we need to deal with. But if you have a segregation of duties issues, I wouldn't kind of shortchange that piece of it. This whole fraud process is adding steps in that process. And so this is another one, and I would recommend that you just don't shortchange it if it's a compensating control. All right, so the next question is, what if you are looking to going away from calling and using just GIAC? From your talk, GIAC only validates bank ownership. So GIAC actually does a few things. So GIAC, I know they are a reseller for early warning, and they're both using the same database that the US banks contribute to, but GIAC has some additional validations in it. So they will also validate OFAC. So you can validate bank account ownership, you can validate OFAC. They also have G-Authenticate and G-Identify. And so what those will do is, you know, they will check against the tax ID. So we talked about the bank and the beneficial ownership under, you know, KYC, know your customer, where GIAC will actually verify the tax ID belongs to that vendor. So that's an additional validation. And then they also have an additional validation with the address too. So they'll let you verify that, or they will verify that that address has been associated with that vendor in the past. So GIAC, again, is using the same database as early warning, but GIAC will also include some additional validations for you. And if anyone is interested in GIAC, let me know. Reach out to me at Debra at DebraRichardson.com, and I will put you in contact with a rep from GIAC. Okay. And the first part of your question, you're talking about moving away from calling. So I was able, with a client that I had in September, I was able to eliminate that phone call altogether, and they were not using GIAC. The problem that they were having is that when they were making that call to the vendor, and this was something that they just started doing COVID, so not sure what their experience would have been before March of this year, but they were having problems reaching the vendor, tracking when the vendors called in to confirm. And so we put the process in place of authenticating the sender and then authenticating the data. And so once you authenticate the sender, you authenticate the data, then is it really necessary to contact that vendor to confirm the change? And the value add for that was when you're confirming the data using the company branded ACH form, that's at a point in the change process where you have the attention of the vendor. If you wait to receive the documents and then review them, do your validations, and then confirm with the vendor, you don't have their attention at that point. And then you've got to go through this. We talked about making a process more efficient. That confirmation process may not be, is definitely not efficient because you've got to document, because again, they may not be there. You've got to find a different person to document, confirm with. You got to document all of that. You may not have their information, so now you got to go find it on their website. So it just may not be, you know, a more efficient process. And so we were able to remove the confirmation process altogether, and they presented that to their auditors the following 2 weeks after we put that new process into place, and that was accepted. So just keep that in mind, that it may be a way to get out of the confirmation process, especially now because the vendors are going through the same thing that we are. Yes, they want their money, but they have the same communication issues that you do. All right, the next question, what if the vendor is not able to validate previous banking details due to layoffs, COVID, or any other changes within the company? So that could be, that can definitely be something that you will hear. And my response to that, or recommendation, is just not to update it. If you have a vendor that says that they cannot validate previous banking details, again, it just means you're talking to the wrong person. A lot of times they don't want to take that extra effort, because again, it's extra effort on their part to find the correct person in the company to give you that information. And someone has it, because when they get paid, that money is being deposited into their bank account, and someone has to post those transactions. And so they have that information. They just don't want to take the time, or don't have the time, or may legitimately not know who to contact at their company, but they need to make the effort to find that out. So if you require the existing bank details, which I recommend that you do, then you require them to either give you the previous existing banking details or the last 3 deposit dates and amounts. And if you ask for that, they'll probably have the existing bank details, because they'll have to go to the person to get that as well. So I recommend that you have that, and just push back on those vendors, because a lot of times they'll like to take the easy way out. And I'll tell you too, you won't get a lot of support from, and you probably already know this, from your internal team members that have the relationship with those vendors, because they're just trying to hurry up and get that piece done. And so they'll give you pushback. I know a lot of people doesn't want to talk about bullying in accounts payable, but I know that happens. Just make sure that you have that as part of your vendor policy. And if you don't have a vendor policy, I know I have a blog that's on there, and that vendor policy really tells your vendors, and you can turn that into their welcome letter, but it tells your vendors and your internal employees how to do business with you, and you make sure that your leadership signs off on it. So when you get pushback on these internal controls and best practices that you're putting in place to protect your company, you have something to fall back on that leadership has approved. So if you want some help with that, make sure you go to my website and listen to or watch a blog. I also have it on a podcast as well. Just search for vendor policy, and it will come up. Okay. Any other questions? I don't see any additional ones here, but I'll give you a couple more seconds. We've got about a minute left. While we're waiting to see if any additional questions will come in, again, you will receive a PDF, or you will receive a the PDF is in here to download along with a brochure of my services, but you'll also receive it in a link tomorrow along with a copy of this recording. Okay. All right, so I don't see any other questions coming in. I want to thank everyone for attending this webinar. If you have any additional questions that you think of after today or after this webinar, please feel free to email me at Debra@DebraRichardson.com, and have a great rest of your day. This webinar is now concluded.